So the Tamamushi Shrine is a good example of early Asuka period narrative painting. It depicts the jataka tales, which are stories about the former lives of the Buddha. So this panel is depicting the story where Buddha sacrifices his body to feed a starving tigress and her cubs. We actually see Buddha appear 3 times. So he appears up here where he's taking off his shirt, and then he appears here after he is diving down this cliff into this valley, and then here he is at the bottom of the cliff being eaten by the tigress and her cubs. So we actually see him 3 times. This type of narrative that you show the figure and you progress the story is called a continuous narrative, and it's a technique used in many different cultures. You can see, despite the fact that we have this narrative, it's a very flat style. Especially there's a lack of foreshortening here at the bottom where the tigress is eating him. You can see there's no recession in his face or anything like that. It looks very flat. The jataka tales help spread Buddhism in Japan, and Buddhism and Shinto coexisted in Japan. During the Heian period in Japan, and also in Korea, Chinese was the language of scholarship. But Heian writers began to use Japanese to write poetry and other forms of writing. So to encourage the writing in Japanese, they developed a syllabary. So a syllabary was created, and syllabaries are a system of writing where each sign stands for a syllable. They based this system on the idiosyncrasies of the Japanese language and the use of traditional Chinese-style brushstrokes to create Japanese characters. Writings were usually made by finely pointed brush held upright, and the development and perfection of Japanese calligraphy, which is what we're looking at here in this image, was one of the legacies of the Heian period. During the Nara and the Heian periods, the Japanese imperial court developed as the center of elite culture. Due to the peace and wealth of the period, the elite had time for leisurely activities such as music and writing, particularly the writing of poetry. The exchange of poems became a common practice and often a preoccupation of lovers. Men and women both wrote poems and accompanied them with paintings and calligraphy. Women in particular became accomplished calligraphers and creative writers in Japanese. In the early 11th century, there was this woman who was a lady-in-waiting to the empress, and she was called Lady Murasaki. She wrote the best-known work of literature in Japan, and it's called The Tale of Genjii. Lady Murasaki learned to write by joining her brother in his writing lessons. And in her mid to late 30s, after she was widowed, it is thought that Lady Murasaki joined the court of the empress and became kind of privy to her court lifestyle, and that this experience inspired aspects of her novel. It is likely that Murasaki was made a lady-in-waiting due to her literary talents. Remember, there's no TV, no iPhones, no internet, so how do you entertain yourself? Well, you listen to stories and poems and things like that. So probably the empress was like, oh, I hear you're a great storyteller. Come and be my lady-in-waiting and entertain me. The epic work is a romance that describes the lives and loves of Prince Genjii and his descendants. The tales feature over 400 characters, and it is regarded as the world's first novel, and it has 54 chapters. The oldest copies that survive of the novel are fragments, and they're from a set of early 12th century hand scrolls. In the hand scrolls, pictures alternate with text. In contrast with earlier Chinese hand scrolls, who choose to depict scenes that display lessons on how to behave, the Japanese artists focused their depictions of the story on the most emotionally charged moments of personal relationships. So this is quite a big difference. So this is an example from that early style, and it's painted in the Yamato style, or the Japanese style, which comes from the Yamato plain, where nea is spelled. This image is an example of what we call women's pictures, or ona-e. Heian scroll painting is referred to as ime kamono, which means rolled pictures, and they're illustrated narrative hand scrolls. They're designed to be viewed in segments as they were unrolled from right to left. And it alternates sections of the painted episodes, like this one, and the text. Ime kamono was an art form specifically used by members of the court. Many were created by court women. The reading of these scrolls were organized and attended by women. So it's kind of like a big deal event where people would gather to listen to these stories. The tale of genjii would have originally covered at least 20 separate scrolls with hundreds of illustrations and thousands of sheets of calligraphy. So the fact that this story and this scroll with these accompanying images are so important and prominent during this period shows us the influence of court women over the entire Heian cultural sphere. So this particular image, this particular scroll, is painted with ink and water-based colors on paper made of the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree and other fibers. In this image, a maid reads to Nakano Kimi, who is a beautiful country girl and is the wife of a high-ranking noble. Another maid combs her hair while her half-sister looks at a picture scroll. So that's what's going on right here. So there's a half-sister, and there she is getting her hair combed. Now, as you can notice, the faces are not individualized at all, and by no means are these like a portrait. Instead, they are not identifiable. They're very kind of stylized. This is to kind of help us relate to the story. So as we're reading the story and we see these images, we sort of can associate ourselves with them because they don't look so different than us because there's just not a lot of portrait details. Now the images and the text emphasize a highly decorative and anecdotal details of the ritualized patterns of behavior in the court. So it's about the court. The images and the text are about the court. Stylistically, we see a flat compression of space with these very stylized faces for the women. We also see the continuous narrative like we saw in the Tamamushi shrine. It shows many images of the same person at once, but again compressing time and space into one image. In an image like this one, we can see the four basic principles of Japanese art. One is suggestion, that which is not fully shown but is understood. Fleeting, tragic nature of existence, the irregularity and accidental look, and simplicity that belies true complexity of art.